Sampling design. By the end of this topic, you should be able to
discuss the concept and reasons for sampling,
assess the criteria of a good sample,
prescribe the appropriate usage of sampling designs, and
4. Examine the process of determining the sample size.
This topic introduces strategies to collect primary data.
The process of collecting primary data must be identified properly based on the purpose and objectives of the research. Data used to answer research questions must come from the appropriate population in order to be useful.
If data is not collected from the people, events or objects that can provide the correct answers to solve the problem, then the process of collecting the data is a waste.
The process of selecting the right individuals, objects or events for study is known as sampling.
Sampling concept.
If the researcher collects and analyzes data from every possible member, this is known as a census.
However, most researchers are faced with the limitation of resources, time, and often access, which made it impossible to collect or analyze all the data. Sampling techniques provide a range of methods that enable the researcher to reduce the amount of data needed, by considering only data from a subgroup rather than from all possible cases or elements.
In order to ensure that the data collected is representative, a few terms related to the concept of sampling must be understood.
Population.
Total collection of elements or cases in which to make inferences. It refers to the entire group of people, events or things of interest that the researcher wants to study.
Element.
It is a single member of the population on whom measurement is taken.
Census.
Count of all elements in a population.
Population frame or study population.
Aggregation of elements from which sample is taken. It is a listing of all the elements in the population from the sample drawn.
Sample.
A subset of the population. It is made up of some members selected from the population.
These are some, not all, elements of the population that form the sample.
Sampling unit or subject.
Element or set of elements considered for selection in the sample. It is the single member of the sample.
Sampling frame.
Actual list of sampling units from which sample is taken.
The process of selecting a sufficient number of elements from the population is called sampling.
A study of the sample and an understanding of its properties would make it possible to make generalization of such properties to the population elements.
The characteristics of the population elements, such as population mean, M, population standard deviation, SD, and population variance, S2, are referred to as parameters.
The characteristics of the sample, the statistics, such as sample mean, X, standard deviation, SD, and variation in the sample, S2, are used as estimates of the population parameters.
How can sampling techniques help to obtain good research results?
Justification for sampling.
The reasons for using a sample are many. In research investigations involving several hundreds and even thousands of elements, it would be impractical to collect data, test or examine every element.
Consider the cost of using a census, the time and the human resources needed. They are prohibitive.
The quality of the information obtained from a sampling study is likely to be more reliable than from a census. This is mostly because fatigue is reduced and fewer errors will result in collecting the data, especially if a large number is involved. In some situations, sampling is required. For example, in testing the life of an electric bulb, it would be impossible to test the entire population, or if burned them, then there would be none to sell.
The advantages of sampling over census may be less compelling if the population is small and variability is high.
Two conditions are appropriate to carry out a census.
A census is feasible when the population is small and necessary when the elements are quite different from each other.
Sampling in qualitative research will be different from sampling in quantitative research.
In qualitative research, the objective is to generate an in-depth analysis of the issue, thus the representative of the sample chosen is less important.
The focus of the research is to gain access to insight on the problems, and generalization of the findings to other similar setting is less emphasized. One popular sampling method in qualitative research is theoretical sampling.
In applying the concept of theoretical sampling, data collection is driven by the theory which emerged along the research.
The next data collection plan is determined by the findings extracted from the data collected previously until theoretical saturation is achieved.
Theoretical saturation is considered achieved when no new concept seems to emerge after two or more consecutive cases.
Activity.
What are the advantages and disadvantages of a census?
What are the reasons for sampling?
When is a census appropriate?
Criteria of a good sample.
A good sample is judged by how well it represents the characteristics of the population.
The sample must be valid, which means it must possess the criteria of accuracy and precision.
Accuracy means the degree to which bias is absent from the sample.
There is no systematic variance in the data and no variation in measures due to some unknown influences that cause the scores to lean in one direction more than another.
For example, the peak season for a tourist destination falls during the long school holidays. If a sample is taken only during the school holidays to collect data on congestion, then accuracy of the data will be reduced.
Precision of estimate is another criterion of a good sample design.
It is impossible to get a 100% representation of the population, because it is expected that some differences in the numerical descriptors happen due to random fluctuations in the sampling process.
This difference is called sampling error, and it reflects the influence of chance in drawing the sampling members.
Sampling error is leftover error after the systematic variance is accounted for. It is supposed to consist of random fluctuations only.
Precision is measured by the standard error of estimation. The smaller the standard error of estimate, the higher the precision of the sample.
Activity.
Although a researcher cannot get 100% accuracy in the research findings, why is it still important to have a good sample design?
Types of sampling designs.
A variety of sampling designs is available, and the choice depends on the requirements of the research, the objectives of the study, and the resources available.
The sampling technique available is divided into two types.
Probability sampling.
With probability sampling, the chance or probability of each case being selected from a population is known and is usually the same.
It is based on the concept of random selection, which is a controlled procedure that assures each population element or case is given a known non-zero chance of selection.
By using a probability sample, it is possible to answer research questions and achieve objectives of estimating characteristics of the population from the sample.
Thus, probability sampling is often used in surveys and experimental research. Researchers use a random selection of the elements to reduce or eliminate sampling bias.
Non-probability sampling.
In non-probability sampling, the probability of each case being selected from the total population is not known.
And it is impossible to answer research questions or address objectives that require statistical inferences about the characteristics of the population.
Although generalizations could still be made from non-probability samples about the population, it cannot be done on statistical grounds. For this reason, non-probability sampling is often used in a case study research.
Activity.
How many types of sampling designs are there in a research study, and which one is the most often used?
Probability sampling design.
Probability sampling is frequently used in a survey research to make inferences about the population based on the sample statistics.
If the population is small, say, less than 30 cases, then sampling is not advisable.
A census should be done because when the population is small, the influence of a single extreme case on the subsequent statistical analysis is more pronounced than for a larger sample.
There are 4 stages in probability sampling.
Identification of suitable sampling frame.
Determination of a suitable sample size.
Selection of an appropriate sampling technique and the sample.
Determination of the representativeness of the sample.
Identification of suitable sampling frame.
The sampling frame for any probability sample is the complete list of all the cases in the population from which the sample is drawn.
The sample must be based on the research questions and objectives.
If your research questions and objectives are concerned with second-year students in the Business Administration degree program, then your sampling framework is the complete list of second-year business degree students.
The completeness of your list is important because an incomplete list means some cases will be excluded and it will be impossible for every case to have a known chance of being selected.
If a suitable list does not exist, then the researcher has to compile his own sampling frame. It is important that the list is unbiased, accurate and current. There may also be organizations that specialize in selling lists of names and addresses for surveys.
If the researcher uses this sample frame, he must make sure of the way the sample is to be selected as well as how the list was compiled and when it was last revised.
Determination of a suitable sample size.
The sample statistics are used to make generalizations on the population parameters. The generalizations from any probability sample are based on the theory of probability.
Larger the sample size, the lower the chances of error in generalizing the population.
The probability sample allows the researcher to compromise between accuracy of the results and the amount of money and time that the researcher has to invest in collecting, analyzing and checking the data.
Thus, the determination of the sample size within this compromise is influenced by
the confidence level in the data.
That is the level of certainty that the characteristics of the data collected will represent the characteristics of the total population.
The margin of error tolerated.
The level of accuracy required for any estimate made from the sample.
the types of analysis undertaken,
the level of minimum threshold of statistical techniques to be considered for data categorization.
The size of the total population. Selection of an appropriate sampling technique and the sample.
Once the sampling frame and the sample size has been determined, the next step is to select the most appropriate sampling technique to obtain the representative sample.
The choice of probability sampling depends on the research questions and objectives, and on whether statistical inferences will be made from the sample.
Other factors that may influence the choice of probability sampling include contacts with respondents, geographical locations of the population, spread, and the nature of the sampling frame.
Furthermore,
the structure of the sampling frame, the size of the sample needed, the nature of the support workers who collect the data, and the ease of explaining and making the technique understood will have some influence on the decision.
5 main techniques can be used to select a probability sample.
Determination of the representativeness of the sample.
The collected data is compared with data from other sources of the population in order to determine the representativeness of the data.
If there is no statistically significant difference, then the sample is representative with respect to the characteristics.
The data is compared to data collected in different time periods to determine representativeness of longitudinal data.
activity.
If Aaron calculated that the adjusted minimum sample size was 439 and his estimated response rate was 30%, what would his actual sample size be?